Morning, everybody. Welcome to our second talk for this year's Data Science for Social Society seminar series. In this one, we are joined by William Bird and Nomshado Lubisi, who are coming from Media Monitoring Africa, and they're here to talk about disinformation and COVID and what we can learn from disinformers and doorknobs. This is a very interesting topic, and I think for a lot of people as well, given our last 2 years of our lives and a bit, it's going to get very interesting to figure out after the fact some of the things that have happened. I myself sat on the COVID Advisory Council for the Gauteng government, and through that also you learn about what really communication, how its role inside health, and some of the things we actually had to experience within that space. So yeah, I think with that, I will be handing over to William and Nomshado. Just in general, we try to keep it to like a 40-minute talk, and then just open up at the end for questions. And then after that, we'll close, and then yeah, we'll see what ideas then get generated on this. So yeah, thank you. William, you can go ahead.
Cool, thank you, and thank you very much for inviting us to join you. So I'm William Bird, I run Media Monitoring Africa, and I'm joined this morning by my very lovely and delightful colleague, Nomshado, who will introduce herself when she takes over. And we're going to do this as a as a two-hander, and because it's virtual, we decided to just split it sort of down the middle, the presentation. So I'll speak for the first half, and then Nomshado will come in. Nomshado, do you want to just say hello?
Hi, everyone. I don't think I need to reintroduce myself, but I think I might introduce myself now so that when I do take over, we're just flowing with the conversation. I'm Nomshado Lubisi, as William has mentioned, and I am the head of communications at Media Monitoring Africa, and we're closely with Real 411 as a reviewer and obviously as the communicator for the platform as well. So I'm excited for the discussion today.
Cool. Okay, let's begin. Thank you. So we've got some nice slides. Hopefully some of them will be super fun and exciting. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Cool. So we're going to start with, and this is probably familiar to all of you, but we're going to start with P, which is pizza. And you might think that the second P stands for pepperoni because that's the pizza that you're seeing there, but actually it stands for pedos or pedophiles, and of course Hillary Clinton. And this was in fact the story in the 2016 lead up to the 2016 elections, where Alex Jones in fact was broadly responsible for suggesting that Hillary Clinton was running a child sex ring out of a pizza restaurant in the middle of New York somewhere. And because of that, it resulted in some nutjob going in with his an automatic weapon, an AR-15, and searching through this place looking to release these children, because this is what apparently Hillary Clinton had done. So we use it as a nice example because even though it's completely and utterly mad, it speaks directly to the issue and the real impact of disinformation. So, sorry, there's someone knocking at my door, which is very annoying. I want to just give a definition of disinformation. Sorry, the hazard of working from home. Nomshado, I just have to step off for 30 seconds. Can you run through the disinformation definition, please? I'll be back in 30 seconds. I do apologize, everyone, even though I'd requested quiet.
No problem. Okay, so just to go through this definition, because I think it's important. During the last years, I think 10 years or so, we first started speaking about fake news and how that term on its own was obviously used politically to push certain agendas, but it really didn't speak to the issue that we were seeing online. And hence the term disinformation is the perfect terminology for what we're dealing with, which is obviously the deliberate dissemination of false information with the intention to cause harm. So these are the creators who obviously have a certain agenda at the end, whether it's for profit or whether it's to change narratives, etc. Misinformation is when I share information or false information without the intention to cause harm. So this is me, a classic example is me seeing a tweet, not verifying if this is factual, and then me resharing that. So I'm the misinformer and resharing basically the disinformers content. So yeah.
Cool, thank you so much, Nomshado. Sorry about that, everyone. So moving on. So when we talk about COVID and disinformation, we also wanted to just highlight that fairly early on in the pandemic, the WHO acknowledged that they're not just dealing with an epidemic, but an infodemic, and they realized the critical danger and harm that mis and disinformation was presenting to the world, and that it could spread just as fast and it's just as dangerous. In terms of MMA, a very quick intro to it. We are nearly 30 years old. Next year we'll be 30 years old. We've done a whole busload of monitoring projects. We work to empower informed, engaged citizenry, and we do a lot of really cool and exciting stuff and innovative stuff. We're doing a lovely project with the UP and CSIR, which we can chat about at some point in the discussion. So just before we get into the trends, we wanted to just set out how disinformation works, right? Which is that usually it's powerful precisely because there's a grain of truth to the disinformation. So whenever you talk about certain issues and you see certain things around disinformation, they're powerful because there's an element of them that makes sense to people. So the white monopoly capital disinformation spread in South Africa, as an example, has power because it speaks directly to the continuing and existing inequalities in ownership and racial dynamics and racist dynamics that continue to exist. And so there's always something to it that makes you think a little bit. The second thing is that disinformation tends to make us angry, anxious, fearful, or uncertain. So whenever there's content that makes you feel that, it's often because there's a lot of logical leaps in the kind of content that you presented. And one of the ways that they help you get over those logical leaps is because they tap on our emotions. They make you go, oh my goodness, how could Hillary Clinton be running a child sex ring in the middle of Brooklyn? This is completely outrageous, and it's something that offends you, so you ignore the fact that actually this is just a stupid idea. The consequence of it is that it undermines our ability to act, to know, and trust. And this is the critical element of mis and disinformation, which is why it's not just a problem for people like us that get excited about these things or working for democracy or computer scientists or universities. It's a problem for every institution of society, because if you undermine people's awareness of knowledge and understanding of knowledge, in the US as an example, if you undermine the idea that there was doubt that the elections were free and fair and that Trump in fact may have won those elections, if you undermine that process to the extent that people no longer know what's real and what isn't, then they go, well, who do we trust? Why should we trust this institution over another? If Vukosi stands up and speaks about these are the results from his latest analysis, you might go, well, why would I want to believe them? He probably just made them up. And the moment you do that, you undermine all of the basic elements of those institutions, of the people, and your ability to act. Because if you don't know if something is A or B, then you don't know how to make an informed decision. If you can't make an informed decision, you are not able to exist and function in a democratic society. So the key end result is that democracy is undermined. Why do people do it? Those are the reasons there. We can chat about that in our discussion. So what we did during during the last couple of years is that we've used Real 411. It's a platform, it's a public complaints platform where you can go and lodge complaints about mis and disinformation. They get reviewed by a team of experts, and then a finding is made. If they believe that something needs to happen with that, we can issue an infographic, or we can ask the platform to take that down if it's serious enough. We see a lot of things going between the different other online harms like incitement and harassment and hate speech, because often these things tend to work well together. We saw in the July looting, for example, a lot of incitement with disinformation. So there were people sharing images of things burning down that weren't even in South Africa, as an example, but using that to encourage people to further go and carry out acts of violence. One of the key elements of this that's been so successful, particularly around the COVID, is that we've worked with the National Department of Health, and there's about 15 other members of that social listening team, which is still going. In fact, our weekly meeting that we have, what's now bi-weekly, is happening at this same moment. So that's some of the stuff that we did together with people to try and coordinate an appropriate response, national response to COVID mis and disinformation. Now, there's a cool little video that explains how it goes, which I'm not going to show you because I don't want to run out of time without what we do. So, nearly there to give you some really cool examples. The thing about disinformation is that it isn't arbitrary, right? It swirls and it shifts and it captures people's fears at the moment. And this is a really interesting thing, a challenge, I think, for you as data scientists, because you've got to work out what are the things that are happening now that we can tap into and see if we can pick up patterns there. We know that this is how it operates, right? It taps into people's fears and heightened anxieties of the moment. So when the July unrest was there, that's where most of the disinformation was focused. When the COVID was the big thing, it was focused on that. At the moment, you're seeing a very deliberate Afrophobic and xenophobic agenda being driven by disinformation agenda being driven by a network of scumbags. The other key thing is that it tends to fill communication gaps. So wherever government usually and the media very frequently aren't giving people enough information and enough answers to help assuage fears or explain critically difficult things, disinformation swoops in and gives us that, right? We've seen that with the Krugersdorp gang rapes, where instead of it being about the gang rape and gender-based violence issues, it's been hijacked in order to focus on xenophobic and Afrophobic issues. So it speaks to current hot button issues. And you often then see trust being used to undermine trust. And that's particularly relevant for the disinformation for COVID. So let's see. So when we started COVID, looking at disinformation under COVID, the first thing that we saw was there was this idea of COVID, it doesn't exist. It's just made up, right? So you saw these wild conspiracy theories where you've got President Ramaphosa, even Trevor Noah, Johan Rupert, and of course the evil Bill Gates, talking about these things as a form of controlling people, right? So there was this initial denial that COVID was a real thing, and it was linked, of course, in South Africa to issues of race, of control. So the moment you have these things, you can see that element of fear being used, right? But the dominant trend at that time was COVID doesn't exist. It's there as a means of controlling us. The moment it started to shift where people were going, oh, oops, actually people are getting really sick, it then shifted to something else, right, which was about crazy cures. It was like, oh, it's basically just a cold. And what you need to do is these things. So in the one on the left here, you can see mix bleach. It directly dissolves the protein. Oxygenated water helps long after soap, alcohol, and chlorine, right? So you've got completely crazy things. If you remember Donald Trump, the president of the United States, you actually gave credence to this idea that bleach could kill it from the inside out, effectively, right? Then you had another one here. You mix lemon juice and bicarbonate in the form of hot tea and drink that, and it kills the virus. So you had this idea of these crazy kinds of things. And of course, then you could see some of the other ones starting to bring in some of those other elements around religious tenets. So you've gone from denial to crazy cures and basic fundamental misunderstandings, including that it's more like flu. Then we started to see this trend of shifting it to extremes, right? And you see this thing, one of the most common ones at the time was 5G. So there was this idea that, in fact, one of the things was government introduced the lockdown because it meant that it then allowed the government to then go, while everyone was locked up at night, they could go and install 5G towers so that they could control us all with COVID. And you saw all of these kinds of things. And again, you think this is completely and utterly ridiculous, right? Because it is patently ridiculous. But we saw in the UK people going and literally destroying 5G towers because they believed that 5G was spreading COVID or responsible for COVID. And of course, then you got the whole thing about 5G. COVID is actually about microchips and about giving us microchips when they come with this evil vaccine. Then you saw another trend, right, which was, and this speaks to that trust, undermining trust, called it bring on the white coats. I don't know if you remember, there were then started to, and this is linked to that idea that you then started to get these people theoretically credible, some of them in fact actual doctors, right, credible potentially doctors, right, coming out and saying no, either COVID doesn't exist, or there are these better cures, or the vaccines are dangerous and will kill you. Like, so you've got medicine, traditional elements, members of trust coming and standing there. They use the symbolism of trust in order to undermine. So if you remember the one on the left, there was this woman, I think she was actually a doctor. She claimed she was from Nigeria, and you could see she held like a mini press conference surrounded by other people in white coats, because of course if you wear a white coat it means you're a doctor and you're credible. I mean, it's just ridiculous. But she stood up and she said, you know, and where I come from in Africa, we use hydroxychloroquine to cure this, and we don't have any cases of COVID and this kind of thing. Picked up again by that nutjob President Donald Trump. And then going to ivermectin. So this picks on two issues around it, right? It muddies the waters of what's there. It's filling a communication gap, and in fact it's getting you to be deeply uncertain about which doctors to believe. So they're now using science almost and doctors to undermine the science and the other doctors. But it also spoke to legitimate fears about and potential drugs, because when hydroxychloroquine was spoken about, there was some suggestion that it may work, as in fact was the case with ivermectin, right? Of course, the evidence now clearly and quite quickly showed that neither of those things work. But what you have here is something that breaks away a little bit from that trend. Normally, disinformation, short, quick, short, sharp, quick, and it's got pricks on your emotions. A lot of these things with these doctors, they tend to be these long, droning, idiot doctors talking the biggest lot of nonsense about these drugs. Often their programs, the one in that video in the bottom right, was this old English fart sitting in a chair talking. I mean, some of his videos literally went on for an hour and a half, presenting all sorts of rambling things. It was almost as bad as listening to Donald Trump. Then, the next shift then, once they realized, okay, actually these things aren't working and people are still dying, and then they came with the vaccines, then of course came the issue of vaccines, it's evil, the pharmaceutical companies are evil, which of course everyone knows they are to a degree, but what they said was, these vaccines, too soon, too fast, they're untested, we don't know what's going to happen, they're not effective, people are all going to die, la 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 la, right? That sort of issue. And again, it's because you're introducing a new thing, people are heightened state of anxiety, but again, it's the same pattern, but it's the different issue that's hitting people's agenda. And that quickly morphed from the vaccines developed too quickly to the vaccines are not effective or they're downright dangerous. And again, you started to see some really clever kind of efforts here where you saw people, with the short, sharp, quick things like those ACDP, that response to an ACDP thing, which we'll come to in a moment, talking about COVID hospitalizations, presenting things as though they're true, and of course there's no evidence. And then you had others, building an entire website saying these are all fake, they don't work, they don't. So you had people going to some effort, which means they were pretty well resourced in order to spread a lot of these disinformation things. So now the next other thing I want you to think about is where some of these things originate. We know that in South Africa, we often, whatever trends we saw occurring in the States, took them maybe sometimes a few days, sometimes a couple of weeks, but they filtered down through to South Africa. So often you'd get them almost untranslated. They'd still talk about dollars, they'd talk about Congress in South African terms and spreading disinformation. And those, again, people using them but being funded to use them. And of course, then you also saw the introduction of politics, religion, and vaccines, and it then became incredibly untidy, because what that does for the public is that you've got senior political figures. In the one instance, a former chief justice, other so-called reputable political parties talking about these things equally and deliberately spreading mis and disinformation, which is very, very dangerous, because again, what they fail to realize, these self-interested doorknobs, is that they don't just undermine science, they're undermining their own institution by virtue of undermining trust in things that we know to be real and otherwise. Then you started to move to outside of that politics, and that politics stuff was driven largely by the local government elections. But then you started to see, okay, vaccines, adverse effects. We know this thing, people are going to die within 2 years, so everyone should have been dead. And you saw lots of these ideas of people coming through having deeply profound adverse effects. Women, having menopause or bleeding again. Some have debilitating tremors, some they can't breathe, and others even being picked up on Wi-Fi card readers. I mean, so that's such a rambling lot of nonsense, that particular post, because it just spreads all of them. But again, the focus there at the time, because it was about adverse effects, always focused on people pulling out these things, saying they're not safe for all of us. This one on the left, all vaccinated people will die within 2 years. This is not a joke, right? And of course, then the other thing they threaten, one of the most powerful things to do to men, if you want to get them to be afraid, is you tell them that if you get vaccinated, you'll no longer be able to get an erection, so don't get vaccinated. And for women, particularly pregnant women, there was that disinformation going around that actually it'll cause you to have a miscarriage. Your baby may be deformed, all of these sorts of other hideous things. And again, some of these things being done and spread with pseudo-scientific facts, again, playing on people's fears. Is the vaccine safe for our children, right? And then in between those things, so those kinds of trends were occurring. So whatever was big in the news and following at the time, the disinformation tended to follow that pattern. In between all of those things, we saw quite a consistent levels of mis and disinformation around these kinds of issues, right? So masks, a lot of mis and disinformation about masks. That guy on the top right-hand corner, apparently he suffered that particular affliction because he was wearing a mask. Then you saw people using this to sell their own nonsense products. So this one in the middle, protection kits now available. That was just using COVID as exploitation. Then you saw a lot of things about the lockdown, a lot of mis and disinformation about the lockdown, and of course one that's still going on, phishing scams. You use COVID, people's fears of COVID, the fact that people are unemployed, to extract their data to disseminate phishing scams. That one's still one of the most popular ones. A lot of general anti-government discourse coming in these kinds of forms of mis and disinformation. And then you had things like Panda, where they used apparently science in order to, again, undermine science, which is just fantastically ridiculous and offensive. So what are the lessons? The first lesson is don't be an aubergine, or don't be an eggplant, or don't be a dick, as I like to say in normal terms. and I say this because it speaks to this thing. Digital Vibes occurred at a time, that Digital Vibes scandal where they spent 150 million rand that was meant to go to on comms. It set people back. It set government back. There was no update for literally 2 months on the coronavirus website. It then had to fall back to civil society and other experts and groups to start to pick up and communicate these things. That has real consequences. People lost their lives because of that, right? So it's not just this, oh, well, the money was there and government fell apart, but it gave a big opportunity for those spreading mis and disinformation to go there. Disinformation, we know, is a social harm, but for this particular emphasis, I want to pick on two things, these other two, which is it cherry picks, right? The thing to think about when you're thinking, how does this apply to data science, is that whatever the big event is, whatever the most anxiety-inducing event is at the time, that's where you'll tend to see the mis and disinformation focus. So when COVID was big, it was focused on COVID. When the July riots were occurring, it focused on them. When the elections occur, it tends to focus on elections. That's the one issue. It can also be sophisticated with resources, so you can get very well orchestrated things. Look at what's happening now with the Afrophobia and the xenophobia. People spending a lot of money, having very clearly dedicated communication strategies on social media to unpack, fuel, incite hatred, aided and abetted by complete morons, scumbag politicians from across the board. But again, those kinds of things, right? And it can also go from outlandish, like we're all getting a 5G chip in our body, to things that are almost credible. Well, could it have this effect? Does ivermectin work? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, you know? So there are things where, again, it's on a gambit. So it's not necessarily something that you can easily just say it is going to be this thing. You'll tend to find it's on a nice sliding scale, again, with those big issues that we spoke about. One of the things that's been most powerful is that combating disinformation, it can't be done by just something like we do with Real 4 in 1. You need experts, you need research people, you need corporates on board, you need governments on board, you need your international NGOs on boards, and it shows you what's possible working together. Where I think we need further and greater input is from data science. And then the last point is a point about journalism, which is why it's so important. You need that in order to counter the disinformation. You need sources of credible, trusted information that people can trust and understand, and that's essential for democracy. So I've given you a sense of, I hope, of what COVID looked like. I mean, sorry, what mis and disinformation looked like over the 2 years of the biggest 2 years of the COVID pandemic. Of course, we're still in it, but over that particular period and how it shaped and shifted for that period. I'm now going to hand over to Nomshado, who's going to speak and go into some detail around how the actual campaigns work. Thanks, Handel.
Thank you, William. Let me just quickly share my screen. I hope I can get confirmation that everyone can see.
Yep, I can see it. Thank you. Over.
I can see it as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I know William went through a lot of, case studies around what we saw during COVID-19, but my section is particularly focusing on how does this actually work? How do they come up with these campaigns? And I think in order to understand how it works, it will help you as researchers as well to be able to, study it a bit more with intent. Let me just try and go next. Okay, so the strategies used to disseminate disinformation. I'm going to go through the message a bit more in depth. I know William mentioned, a few elements about it. 2, how it's amplified. 3, how they use the truth, obviously, and how they use, dehumanizing tactics around that. I'm going to also look at how environment settings contributes to that, and most importantly, how disinformation undermines our democracy in a whole. So what do you need to spread disinformation? Number one, you need a very strong message to deflect attention. In most instances, when there's a lot of information going around, let's use COVID-19, for example, it tends to get quite confusing for an individual. And having a message that is curated in such a manner that it challenges the factual or credible information that is actually being shared is one of the key elements that disinformers use to spread disinformation. The second one is the assistance of bots and botnets, and I'm going to go into depth with that. And we're also going to be looking at trolls and troll networks. And I think this one is the biggest one that they need. And I think William touched on this a bit, at how you always see a lot of disinformation around big events or big critical moments in a country, or whether it's health issues, etc. So you'd see in elections how they'd use that environment to achieve their agenda. And the last one, I mean, a vulnerable public, and how they play around people's emotions to get what they want. So first is looking at the message. And I think this is also where a lot of people tend to struggle when it comes to disseminating whether, verifying whether this is disinformation or if it's credible information, is that disinformation always uses a percentage of truth. And by doing that, it's already situating itself as the same level, almost same level as credible information. So it would make people look into it further. So we all knew that COVID-19, came about, and in the beginning stages, a lot of people didn't know what it was or how it spreads, etc. And by just using that, 20% element of truth, they were able to already, cause anxiety, uncertainty as to whether it really does exist or it does not. And in most instances, what they would use is they would try to take sources that are seen as credible. So whether it's an expert in the field of that particular issue, in order for them to up the percentage of their own credibility. So how they craft their narratives is really key, and how they incorporate the truth as well. And just to give a more visual example of this, outside from COVID-19, there was a time where WhatsApp was down and Facebook was down, and a lot of people in South Africa obviously were all going through the same thing. It was trending on Twitter, etc. The following day, there were voice notes already going around saying the reason why there was a shutdown of these apps is because they're busy collecting all your information. If you don't do 1, 2, 3, your WhatsApp services will be deactivated. And if you don't obviously share the voice note, it means that you are not eligible to continue to use WhatsApp. So those instances and those elements of truth is what they really thrive in. The second one is bots and botnets. And I think the biggest problem here is that there's not a lot of literacy around the understanding that not every single profile that you see online or on your social media platforms is an actual person behind it. So bots, obviously, these are automated social media networks or accounts that are used, to disseminate information or pose as well as real people. And in most instances, it works as a group of accounts. So you'd find 10 accounts pushing the same thing. And obviously, if they've got the money to do it, they would use more accounts to push their narratives. And these are the same accounts pushing the same message. So you'd see them literally posting in seconds, beyond human capabilities of tweeting, for example. And obviously, the more people are exposed to this content, the more they want to engage with it, and the more they're seeing that, oh, more than one account is actually posting about this, so it might really be true. But also just to note importantly here is that not all bots are malicious or political. Bots can be used for a very strong awareness or educational campaign, whether it's around health or whether it's around digital literacy, etc. So it's just the person behind who's using it and what intentions that they really have. This is also just tips on how to spot a bot. So number one, as I mentioned, the frequency of how they tweet or post in terms of their activities. As I said, you'd find that in less than 5 minutes, they'd probably have like 10 tweets out. And we all know that somebody wouldn't be able to, in less than 2 seconds, be able to tweet so consecutively. And most of the time, they either have profile pictures that are not identifiable. So whether it might be a cartoon character or even a celebrity or somebody that is not necessarily, posing as a real person. And the biggest thing is the amplification of the same message. And you'd see that usually when one account would post, the rest would follow. So it's usually very coordinated, and you're able to even pick up all the other bot accounts that are there based on the coordination of the first tweet that goes out, for example. Thirdly, trolls and troll networks. And we've seen how this has really had a huge impact, especially online. And this is basically used as a tactic to, dehumanize an opponent in the sense that if somebody had to be coming on an online space and in simple terms, posting something, maybe saying, what they're saying about COVID, you dying in 2 years is not true. And literally under that, you'd see comments attacking that individual based on the mere fact that they're obviously trying to combat the disinformation that's going around. And they do it in such a manner that they nitpick on the individual's characteristics, and features. So whether it's the hair, skin color, body size, etc. And in doing so, it's almost making it personal. It's a personal attack to them in order for them to sit back from actually countering the narrative that they are strongly speaking on. And I touched on this a bit, and I think it's something that as years have gone by, people are starting to realize that there is something such as algorithms, and there is such a thing as filter bubbles, that your online space almost mimics what you interact with daily. It mimics, what you search, what you like reading, which channels maybe you like following, or accounts that you like following, and it bounces all of that back to you. And in understanding this is almost an environment that is, building a whole echo chamber around you of different news sources or different hosts of accounts that are trying to give you the content that they seem to have, studied, that you're interacting with quite a lot. But interestingly enough, even in this space, you do find that, when the realization is that your algorithms are set in such a manner that you interact with a lot of sports, and obviously somebody's trying to make a quick buck out of that, you get a news site or a website that is clearly not credible and is very dodgy, and would try to obviously come into your own echo chamber as well. So this environment really also gives that influx of information that it almost becomes, quite an overload, that one really needs to be able to always double check, recheck as to what is it that they're reading and what is it that they're really sharing. And just to quickly summarize this, I was trying to really go to save our time. It really sums it up to these three, tactics. The laundering part of it. So they try to legitimize whatever it is, whatever narrative that they're trying to push, and really make it so credible that it might seem that the truth on its own is actually not the truth. And I think the biggest question even around this was that when we now try to come into a space where disinformation has been spread, and it's found that, that narrative was actually not true, and we would try to come in with a campaign, for example, that actually, shares what the credible narrative is. A lot of people take time to relate to the credible narrative because they have been so exposed, and they've been really interacting with the false narrative to a point where it legitimizes that content. And the second one is making it relatable to the individual. And once again, this is the emotional element of a human being. This is the part where, it kind of inspires their ways of thinking and their behavior with, online information as well. And replacing with questions. And this is the biggest one, I think, around disinformation that I've been seeing that for the past year, it's been really coming to play as a tactic, whereby they would bounce back questions, questioning the truthful narrative or the credible information. So using the COVID-19 case, vaccines, for example, they would be asking questions such as, how sure are you that, you know, the side effects won't cause you to die in 2 years? So instead of framing it as a statement, it would be framed as a question, which is obviously then created to kind of get the person thinking on their own and creating their own doubts based from those questions that were created as a counter narrative. And I'd like to end off this session with just a bit of a practical element to it, because I think when we're talking, and I think, well, the next questions that we're going to ask you as data sciences, data scientists around the role that you can play, I think it's important to look at how it amplifies, but also what already is there and what needs to start happening in each individual for them to be able to know that they are interacting with credible information. So this is just an example which was basically posted during the unrest. It was a video on Twitter. At that current point that the screenshot was taken, it was 219,000 views, but obviously by now it was probably way over this. And this is somebody who went on Twitter and shared that this is the situation right now in Jozi. Stay away from Bree Street, small street guys. And it's a video of a burning building, and people are really jumping out, you know, in a haste to try and save their lives. People are panicking, a lot of smoke and shouting. And under this tweet, there were so many comments amplifying this video. And if somebody literally just paused it and had a further in-depth self-investigation to realize that this video actually might not be a video from Bree Street, for example. And this is now to start looking at, when we're talking about visual content created by disinformers, we need to start looking at location, people, languages, monuments. And I think from this, you can see that from the billboards themselves, or the advertising boards on the building, that this is definitely not one of South African languages. You can even see with the monument style itself. And even in the video when it was playing, you could hear the language that they were speaking, that obviously this is not one of the languages that are spoken in South Africa. The attires that people were wearing as well, you could clearly see that this is a huge red flag. But because it was shared in the height of tension, fear, anxiety, there was no time, I mean, not time, but there was no understanding or reflection of being able to investigate further rather than just sharing and commenting. And at the top there, I just added tools that one could use to start, you know, investigating further when it comes to videos or images, which is obviously your reverse image search, such as your Google Images, your Tenai, and your Invid. Yeah, so I thought I should add this example just to kind of give a more practical sense of the disinformation content we are also speaking about. I'm going to end off with the video. I'd like to really apologize for the language, but I think it's one of the videos that really, I think, highlight and emphasize how disinformation has become so sophisticated that it's really becoming very difficult, if done very well and if done very, you know, to the T when it comes to the technology that was used. It gets really scary that it could push a narrative based on an individual that did not even say something along those lines. And this is what you call a deepfake video, which uses images to manipulate, images and audio to manipulate an individual who is perhaps speaking at a different moment, but making them say something completely else differently. And this is based on using their voice, using their images, and a bit of their hand movements. I think this is one of the most sophisticated examples that you could probably come across. Some of you maybe might have seen this, but for those that haven't, it would be kind of great to see. So I really hope you can hear.
We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time, even if they would never say those things. So, for instance, they could have me say things like, I don't know, Killmonger was right, or Ben Carson is in the sunken place, or How about this? Simply, President Trump is a total and complete dipshit. Now, you see, I would never say these things, at least not in a public address, but someone else would. Someone like Jordan Peele. This is a dangerous time. Moving forward, we need to be more vigilant with what we trust from the internet. That's a time when we need to rely on trusted news sources. It may sound basic, but how we move forward in the age of information is going to be the difference between whether we survive or whether we become some kind of fucked up dystopia. Thank you. And stay woke, bitches.
So that is, I think, the next level of narratives that we hope that we might not see more of them, but clearly this is the road that we are going at, and it really emphasizes the importance of us being able to combat that. Yeah, and I hope it really sparks, quite a lot of thoughts in your mind as well. But to end off my session, and I think these are the questions that I spoke of earlier on to you as data scientists to, see how you play a role, because obviously we know that disinformation, while it is reactive, to hot issues, etc., but they tend to use similar tactics and just advance in them, and they're often looking at emotions, often looking at being short and straight to the point, and really easily can be spread, using the different platforms that we currently have and people that are, that people are also using. And I think this then I'd like to leave for you to think about, what strategies can data science then use, maybe perhaps to exploit these or to find the weaknesses to help combat, expose, whether it's to report, and even, what action can one take towards ensuring that we're doing all that we can to combat disinformation before we see it really greatly affect our democracy. And that's it from me. I think we are now off to the exciting part of questions and engagement. Thank you.
Okay, a big thanks in this case to MMA, both to William and Nomshado. I think there were some questions that seemed to be going on in the chats, and William has also been answering some of them. But I think just to kick off before I if somebody wants to ask a question, you can just raise your hand. I'll acknowledge you and then you can ask. But I'll kick off here on. So if we look at the evolution of the internet, right? So it starts off as a tool that we're using, to share information. As time goes on, it becomes this new, very big economy that is going on, and it's really driven by two things. So one, personal information, and then two, to get your personal information, grabbing your attention. So these are two things that then, if we're thinking about disinformation and misinformation, it's like, it's impossible not to have it, just because the profits are a lot. We've worked, some work from the lab has been on identifying misinformation websites, right? And you might find that they're created by the same person, and they would then have two websites that are on two different sides of the political spectrum. So let's say in South Africa, you think DA, ANC. So one is very positive towards that, one party, very negative towards the other, and the one. And then at the end of the day, behind it, it's the same person, same people who are creating it, just because all they're trying to do is grab attention, get you to their website. Somehow you click on a link, and then they get paid from the ads that are being served on there, right? So this is completely connected to that information plus personal information, then plus the attention. So on one side, how does MMA think about this in terms of even the media in general, given that these like, it seems as some parts of the economics of journalism have been changing, and it's getting harder and harder. The people can then start mimicking that, to look like your proper professional media, and how does that go? Like any thoughts on that? And second one, your engagement maybe with both the government as regulators and the social media giants. What are things maybe we should take away from that? Are they actually doing something? Have they increased the amount of resources that they're putting towards these problems, or it's more like, stonewalling? They don't really need to do it on the African continent. Yeah.
Sure, a lot of questions wrapped up there. I'll have a bash first, and then Handel can add. Yeah, I mean, you're completely correct. It makes money for people, and it's easy to make money from. And we have to find ways of dismantling those economic incentives. The problem for social media, and let's be clear, social media platforms couldn't give three flying stuffs about this because they've been making money from it. What made them sit up and act was the fact that people were outraged at things like inciting genocide, inciting violence, using it for hate speech, using it to spread Nazi propaganda, using it to spread mis and disinformation, because it causes fundamental real harm. The social media platforms didn't care about that. They reacted because governments said, no, this is not okay, right? Because when your goal is to make profit, you aren't, if you're making profit from bad things, goody for you. Human traffic is kind of traffic human in people because it's a very lucrative process and a lucrative business, as is the drug trade. You've got to find ways of undermining the economics of that in order to act. So when it comes to disinformation and these online harms, the social media platforms, there are lots of good people who work there, and there are some legitimate efforts that they're making, but they're not going to occur in any meaningful and substantive way until and unless you get clear pressure being applied from states, clear pressure being applied from research entities, academia, civil society, and other kinds of bodies, because they aren't going to do that unless they do. So we interact and engage with government, and the things that the social media companies fear, of course, is that you'll just shut them down, which obviously we would be vehemently opposed to, because that's not going to solve anything, right? What you do need to do, though, is that they do need to act in a manner that is in line and in accordance with the values of the country they're in. In South Africa, that's determined by our constitution. The problem, of course, is, as you also then pointed out, just a little tag on at the end of your question, do they care about Africa? The short answer is no, they don't, right? They are very opaque about how many people they actually have looking at content in Africa. They claim that they can look at all of our languages, but there's no way that they can, and certainly that they can understand the meaning and implicit concerns that we have there, right? The only way you're going to get that is to go along the lines of what they've done in Germany, where they do have thousands, literally thousands of people, just for one little country in Europe, in Western Europe, they have thousands of people tracking content, removing content that speaks to Nazi issues. I can tell you now there are none of those farms of people here looking at that, and certainly not looking at it in our African languages. And language issues are, of course, a significant issue for them. One of the senior executives I was on a call with, she used to be at Meta. She said, if you want to look at how seriously these companies are taking these issues, look at what they're spending on R&D and look at where they're spending that money. And most of that money is being spent in the USA and in Western Europe. Very little, certainly we know from the budgets our people get in South Africa, there's no money for this kind of thing, which means that they aren't really looking at it here, which means that we, until that time, our efforts have to be on applying pressure, continually exposing, showing them hard evidence so that they are forced actually to act, and then working with the state in a way that doesn't unduly undermine people's rights to freedom of expression to act. Over.
All right, thank you. Oh, Nomshado, do you have something on your side?
Yeah, no, I think just to add on, I think one of the key issues that you spoke on, and that is news websites being created, obviously to peddle mis or disinformation or stories or stereotypes or propaganda. And reality is they do exist. And they do do it in such a way that they actually even mimic your credible media houses. An example of this would be you'd have a website, Sowetan1. .co, etc. And obviously now you see Sowetan and an individual click on it and say, oh, it's Sowetan, obviously not seeing the one or not seeing the extra character that is put in there in the website link. And this is in such a way that it's obviously very profit driven. It's all about clickbaits. It's all about getting you on the main homepage to see ads. But the problem lies then when these sites are actively pushing a certain agenda. And I think we saw this around COVID-19, where there were a number of websites that were created, particularly there to obviously push narratives against vaccines or really populating information, linking back to various YouTube channels, etc. And it became quite a I think a serious issue that YouTube, I think, took down quite a number of those channels as well, because they were really becoming a huge problem, because they were not only coming from that platform, but they were coming from websites driving people back to those YouTube channels. But at MMA, we have what we call KnowNews, and this is an extension that you can get on Chrome or Firefox. And this is kind of our innovative way to try and combat those, dodgy news websites, and to kind of assist people to know that is the website that they're interacting with credible or is it dodgy? And if it's dodgy, it would give you a bit of a red flag at the top right, or if it is credible, it would give you a green flag. And these are one of the ways that we are obviously trying to contribute towards fighting against those types of news websites being created.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions from the room? I think there were a couple of things that went in. Also, one I think that was interesting was, hey, do we go towards something where we have a censored internet and people have to almost like, get approved to be allowed to post? Is that too much on the really
I think
crazy?
I mean, reality is that social media was originally, and it still does, it gives people the opportunity to exercise their right to freedom of expression, and it gives them the right to interact with critical societal issues. You can literally, especially as a country in Africa, I think South Africa has really been in the forefront of that freedom. But once you start censoring, and once you start almost directing what people can post or cannot post, I think that's where now you're kind of crossing that line over, people's rights as well. I think the biggest thing is to work with the relative, parties, which is your big tech, your government. I think everyone needs to come together here. There needs to be a very strong multi-stakeholder approach to ensure that the online space is a healthy space, that we are interacting with credible information, and there is something that happens if somebody goes on there to drive a specific agenda. But censorship, I don't think that's the way to go.
I think a last one had been on these things of okay, so one is language. We work a lot on African language, and dealing with machine learning tools for this. So what have you seen out there, or do people try to use more local languages as a way to actually hide in plain sight, meaning it's easier to spread misinformation that way because the systems might be set up in English? And two, maybe picking up on what William said earlier, when you interact with some of the executives of the African offices or the South African offices, like there is the thing of, okay, let's apply pressure and let's bring regulators in there. But actually what have been the things they've been trying to do. Like it's very hard. Maybe we don't see it because we don't interact with them. When it comes to that, I know their offices typically are business and regulatory, and you seem to be maybe the people who are closer to these spaces than we are. But what actually are those discussions? What actually is being, we don't obviously have access to the engineering teams, so they're not here. Yeah.
So, I mean, some of it is that a lot of it, to be perfectly frank, is lip service, right? Let's be clear. And certainly when they do try and tackle these things, there are some good moves. Like once they agreed around disinformation around COVID, for example, most of the platforms were pretty quick to shift their algorithms to look for certain things, to remove quite a lot of content, right? Which was, I think, broadly speaking, quite good. But where they still fail is that there's no one of the reasons Real 411 is powerful is because we apply the same standard to the same harm. Platforms don't. So something that can be banned on Twitter, for example, as we saw with Donald Trump's utterances in 2019, was allowed to stay up on Facebook. Now, you can't have a scenario like that because it was exactly the same content, taken off one platform, allowed to stay on the other. And that's just crazy, right? Because it says that there's no standardized common guidance to what these things are. Facebook or Meta's terms and conditions, when their community guidelines, they don't even talk about it as disinformation. They talk about it as false information, right? So the terms that they use, the ways that they approach it are very often very different. The way their responses to when they find it are very often very different. So, we've got a long way to go in dealing with this. And are they doing enough? No. Are they doing nothing? Equally, no, they aren't. It's not like they're not doing anything. They are, they're doing, I think what they like to see is that they're doing enough to kind of keep the regulators off their backs. But I'm not sure that is going to be enough. When it comes to local languages, sometimes you do see that. There are often terms, some of the hashtags that will trend can be local languages in order to spread particular ideas. But by and large, a lot of this stuff seems to be still English-based, and certainly that's the case with COVID. And I think that isn't necessarily is because a lot of it was imported directly from the States. A lot of it being supported by these libertarian movements, these right-wing libertarian movements. And when it's coming from America, you're not getting local languages that are driving it. So even those things that are kind of loosely translated into South African kind of English still have a lot of Americanisms in them. But I think that where you look at something like the Zuma and the July unrest, I suspect that there was a lot more stuff going on there than we were being exposed to, especially in African languages.
Okay, yeah, on that, thanks to William and Nomshado. I think this was very informative. There are some students here also who are working within these spaces, and hopefully this will assist them as they are building on. I think there'll be a request, I think, from one of the students to really work with Real 411 on a multimodal identification system. So ones that don't just use the text, but use the text and also the images that are coming in and within there. So look out for that email. Thanks everybody for joining. And I know it's early in the morning, but the reason is that we want you to have the rest of your days to yourself and do the rest of the things and go do good work out there. Thank you. And yeah, we'll update you guys very soon in terms of everybody on the next talk. There's a very interesting set of speakers also coming on in the next three talks as well. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for inviting us. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.
Happy Friday. Bye.